Hello, welcome to another video, and today I'm going to talk about the glutes and how I might use as many as 20 different exercises to strengthen them. This is sort of following up from some of the videos I've done recently where I've discussed why you need to use a wide variety of exercises if you really want to strengthen something, and especially for weak areas like the glutes and the hips. So I'm going to go through a lot of exercises. Some of them are the same exercise done in several ways, so you could argue it's one exercise or three, but starting with this first one, just the simple bridge. So the simple bridge, everyone will hip extension. Most people are familiar with that. So it's just coming up and holding that position. So, you know, it can be quite effective in some regard at strengthening some weak glutes, but really it doesn't do anywhere near enough to really make a big difference. It might help people just engage it a little bit. Sometimes it can be a problem, as we'll discuss later. If I move this to a single leg version, it's actually way more effective. So in that holding position, I use this as an assessment quite a lot because I can gauge like how that person's using the core in conjunction with the glutes, which is what's going to come up a lot when I see standing things like single leg exercises or suitcase carries and things like that. So usually I'll see in that point there that the glute that should be working on this side in conjunction with the hamstrings on this one. So this isn't isolating the glute, still sort of the posterior chain, but you'll often see this side can't actually hold itself up, so it'll collapse down and you'll see this other hip drop down towards the floor. So it can be in the beginning stages with real significant weakness or injury. It can be a great way to start the process of rebuilding it and restoring the strength to where it should be. But like I said, its disadvantage is that it has two disadvantages. It only trains the muscles in the shortened position and not in the lengthened position, and it's often in the lengthened position the bigger problems arise. And secondly, it's just nowhere near enough resistance to make any big difference. All right, so the next one I would use would be the bird dog exercise, or horse stance I call it, but a lot of people refer to it as bird dog. So I could do this again as a basic bodyweight version first. This is the more advanced version with resistance. So I'll sort of skip the bodyweight one because it really is more of a stability exercise, not really a strengthening exercise at all. Where this one actually does have the resistance where I'm trying to actually push that backwards. So really the only muscle that can do that is the glutes. The hamstrings will contribute, but they're really ineffective at doing this just because of the horizontal position that you're placed in. Now this is a superior exercise to the previous one because I'm actually strengthening it in the weakened point. So like right at this point here is where I'm at its weakest because the muscle's fully lengthened and stretched. All right, so to really engage that with the resistance pushing backward, I need a lot more. That's why a lot of people find this very difficult, especially when you add the arm part to it like he's got there. So if I was just had two hands on the ground, I'd have more control, more leverage, but with less leverage I need more strength, more stability, much more difficult exercise. But as per the previous one, can be really, really effective at like the single leg version, at eliminating the compensation that we would see later on with the more effective and rigorous exercises that would also come with bigger risks. So where you might see the problems going into the piriformis for piriformis syndrome or the lower back or SI joint, or even just collapsing and causing knee problems. So this way, so this will be the regression of what I was just doing then, where I've got both hands on the ground. So if the person's really struggling, I might have to do that. But this can be a really good way to do things, but you know, to get everything working the way it's supposed to without making a huge difference in the strength. All right, so that'd be like two versions of like trying to do the same thing but completely differently. Their process. So let's have a look at the next one, because the next one brings in a different thing again. Okay, so this next one is like where we're looking at the movements of abduction and external rotation, which we did not see in the previous two, which were just purely hip extension. So the previous two were both hip extension, but different versions of it. All right, now this is like a version of the clam exercise, but we call this the closed clam because it has more control of the hip, has a very limited movement, and the resistance is actually just holding. So I just want an isometric contraction on this. And basically its purpose is to try and center the femoral head right inside the hip socket. So it's a very gentle exercise in many regards, and like the previous two, it doesn't do anywhere near enough to fully finish the job, but it may be very useful in the beginning because I don't have enough control. So that'd be my first version. I often might use that with people who really like hip impingements. It can be useful. Sometimes it does nothing. Sometimes it might even aggravate things. But like I said, the low intensity doesn't really make long-lasting changes. It's needed to make enough of a change to do more with the hip. So the next one being the normal clam, so we call it the open clam shell. And this is where I add a resistance band, so automatically it's a lot harder. And again, this is where I want to sort of observe differences in the hips. This is where I've got that full abduction, which we didn't get in the first two exercises. So this time we start to see a completely different action of the hip that has to be performed. So the one on the ground is working equally as hard as the one on the top. So because it has to resist the band just yanking it up. There's a lot of problems with this one. Sometimes it can really wind up the TFL muscle a bit too much, which then further inhibits the glutes, so sort of defeats the purpose of using it. One other benefit of it is it teaches a person the hip disassociation, where basically learning to move their hip without compensating through the lumbar spine and trying to move around their body, which we saw on their single leg hip extension. This one's a little bit more effective. So if I just go back, you can see how I'm placing my hand, pushing it into the ground to try and give myself a much more stable base. So I can't move from here at all, and it's just the hip moving by itself. All right, so this is sort of teaching my upper body and my core especially to remain stable and strong. So it can be quite a useful way to do that. Now I could actually follow this on and turn it into a side plank. So this is usually known as just as a core exercise for the obliques, but in many ways in this kneeling version, and you'll see how the band moves apart as I come forward. So as I go back, my knees will come together, but as I come forward, I'm pushing my hips, and there's that hip extension feeling that we saw in the first exercise, but it's a lot different with gravitational resistance coming down on top of me while I'm trying to move forward. So I'm sort of having different sort of reactions, and this hip here has to remain really, really stable and in the socket like the closed clam, and I'm getting a ton of work from the core. So a very underrated version of a glute exercise, even though it's not really known as one. All right, so there's a couple more that I would use. So let's look at the next one. Okay, so this is the first sort of standing version, I suppose, and very similar to the one we did at the start, the bird dog, but just in the standing position is a little bit different. So I'm doing that same hip extension in this standing action. So what makes it a lot different is the stance leg. The stance leg has to really work hard. It's arguably working harder than the pushing leg, but I can really generate a lot of strength through the glute max on the pushing leg, while I'm generating a lot of work in the glute medius on the stance leg. So obviously when I switch it around, I can get the best of both. Now, me holding on to the pole here guarantees my stability, so I'm not having to fight with the balance, and I can, just like the other versions, keep the core really strong while I'm working that hip extension. All right, so everything in my upper body is staying dead still, so very much like we just saw at all the previous ones. And that's really a big key to it. But again, that point right there is where the glute is really exposed. It's really weak here because it's so overly stretched and lengthened. That's also why most of the time these exercises are much more beneficial in the long term because they're actually addressing the weakness where it really exists, as opposed to some of the other ones which we'll look at in a minute, where it trains the strength in its shortened position, which is great, but improving the strength, but not really where we need it. This is going to be more beneficial to where we need it. All right, so you can see how they're all these different angles. They're all doing lots of different things. Some look similar, but some are a lot more different. And as you'll see towards the end, they'll have a difference in tempo as well. So everything so far is slow. A lot of them are holding to try and get that isometric control and get more stability because it's not stable enough. All right, so let's look at the next one. Okay, so the next one is pretty simple. It's the hip thrust. So really it's just the basic bridge or hip extension, but with a heavy load. And now I could keep a band on like I would use for the clams or crab walks. Now this, it can be really effective for some people and it can be really problematic in others. It might allow me, in the cases where it's beneficial, it might allow me to really get that strength that is so difficult to get with the other ones. And I really might be able to make some small inroads that maybe taps into making the other ones a lot easier to do and not painful, and it can be really helpful. So for people with SI joint where they're really cranked into extension, this might be a good way to help them prevent that, which then allows me to get to the exercises that they can't really do. But on the flip side, the person who's got that really shortened, like stuck in the posterior tilt, or got sciatic problems and piriformis syndrome, this might really wind it up. So I might not use this with, I might be very careful who I use this with. Also not really placing too much emphasis on how much they lift. I'm not, like getting too carried away, think I've changed everything because they're lifting 100 kilo. All right, so it can be a little bit overrated at times, but like I said, you can allow it because it's so simple, and you're also, if I go back, I'm really training it, so I get like a huge amount of strength from being in that shortened position, so I can lift way more than I could with squats and deadlifts, and especially with lunges and single leg things. I can never do the loads that I could do with this, so which is a good thing for the glutes if I really want to get them to do what they should be doing. So it's just like you've got to take it with a grain of salt that it's only a stepping stone, a small part of the puzzle, all right, where some people overuse it, and then they also end up with really shortening the muscle off too much, creating bigger problems. All right, so let's look at the next one. Okay, so the next one's the basic crab walk. So most people are pretty familiar with that, and again, it's very much like the clam in that I've got the resistance band around the knees. So now I'm working in that hip abduction again, but combining it with hip extension. So as opposed to just the clam where I'm side lying, I've actually got a lot more hip movement. So this makes this way more effective. I'll have a lot more muscle involved with the quads and the hamstrings getting a lot more involved than the isolated part of just the glutes. So I'm getting a bit of a share of the workload, but can be a great way to introduce that person into standing exercises, because I have to get to the standing ones if I want to make a big difference. Now, the disadvantages to it is that it's really not enough to make a big change. And I've got to also be like the clams, be wary of like winding up the TFL, because I could end up creating a problem from doing this. So I don't always use this one too much. I might use it as a warm-up drill, but that's about it. Sometimes I might combine it with the hip thrust to get that bit of overload. But again, knowing that until I really get to the single leg and split stance movements, haven't really changed too much. All right, so let's get to the next ones, because the next ones are where we start to make the bigger difference. Okay, so now we're at the point where we're really going to start making a bigger difference. So I might have needed all of those exercises prior to this to get to this point where I can really do this. I could have been doing this with very light things like kettlebells. So this is basically a Romanian deadlift, but once I start applying load, I make a bigger difference to everything. And it's very similar to the bird dog ones and all the ones where I'm in that bent over position, because I'm really placing the glutes in their most vulnerable point, so which is right there. So Obviously the hamstrings are a huge part of this, but they should be, because they should be working in conjunction with it. That's why they're called the posterior chain. But often what we'll see is the person can't get into this position where they have like that nice neutral curvature of the spine. So they needs to have a slight anterior tilt to be able to generate that. If they're stuck in this posterior tilt, then they can't do it, which is why the hip thrusts and that can be a real problem, where you might have strength for that, but only that. But not every time you stand, you can't do anything. Their side joint people will usually, when they stand up, they'll generate a little bit too much excessive extension, so they won't get, they'll be sort of locked in this anterior tilt and then jamming their lower back. So this is where I might need the hip thrust to work in combination with it to try and give them a bit of everything. But usually this one's a great one for resolving the poor alignment of the hip, which I've spoken about so many times in other videos, but really getting the femur to sit right deep into the hip socket and then generating that extension to thrust my hip forward, so that I can pick things up with my legs, as opposed to using my lower back or trying to sort of do some weird squat version, which is really inefficient and just blows my knees out. Right, so now I could use a couple of versions of this to really change things, which we'll have a look at. So to make this easier, I could, well, not easier, actually harder, but if I can make it more effective, because usually I'll have one side that's quite weak. It's very rare to have both sides extremely weak. I usually got a problem with one. I could really use a resistance band to try and pull into that weak side. So you can see here, as Dylan's lifting that weight up, I've got that band pulling right out into his weaker hip. So the resistance pulling this way is forcing this leg to resist the pull and push against it that way. So even though I've got the gravitational forces of the barbell going up and down, I at the same time, like a crab walk, have a push away from the pole so that he doesn't lose his balance and fall over to his left-hand side. All right, so it can really train that weaker side a lot harder than normal within the action that we really need it to be good at, which is why this can be so effective. All right, so it's one way I might be able to progress the RDL before I move into single leg stuff, which is the same problem we're going to encounter. All right, so let's look at those. So another exercise I could use that's similar to the Romanian but a lot harder is the trap bar. So where the Romanian I'm going from the top down, now I'm really lifting from the bottom up. I can really sort of add some significant load to this, which is very similar in many ways to what we've done with the hip thrust, where I'm just exposing the muscles to a significant amount of stress. A lot easier to control than the single leg stance again, but the real problem is obviously in this bottom point right here, where everything's really exposed, the weakness. So you really got all of that having to generate, and especially if you've got a lot of load, really trying to push forward so you could stand upright. So it can be one way. I tend to treat this with a bit of caution, because you can get a bit too crazy and the risk outweighs the benefit, but it can be useful for some people. All right, so that's another version I might use from time to time. All right, so at this point I could probably, before I move into single leg things, I could train the glutes with squats and lunges. So squats are very much more of a quad loaded movement, but because the glutes are a big part of it, I can still train them quite effectively. I just don't really want to go crazy with the loads and shorten the range. I'll get like a lot more glute involvement if I can get deep into it. All right, so some people can't go too deep. You're just going to create trouble if you do so. So I would use these movements with a lot of caution. But if the technique is okay, I could really get some different sort of activation there, and getting them to work within different movements, so that it learns how to stay stable and strong in not just one thing but all things. All right. So if you don't teach it how to do it, it'll just default back to what it was doing prior to all the problems, which you haven't really changed anything because it's not really good at that. So that's where it can be useful in this, but I just would treat it with a bit of caution. You should find it has the squat pattern in particular can be a real problem with hip injuries. All right, so let's look at the lunge one. Okay, so as per the squat, we could add in the lunge. Now, I probably wouldn't add load like this, but I could just use some very slow and stationary, really controlled lunge variations to see how well the person can control the glutes into this phase. Obviously, there's a fair bit of quadriceps going on. It's a bit more of a knee-loaded movement, but again, like I said with the squat, really important to bring into play because I can teach that body how to sort of effectively recruit the glutes in a different movement pattern. Again, sharing it with things, so making it understand how to interact with other muscle groups and other joints, which is really important. So it just might be a bit difficult. Just depends on the person again if I might use this early on or not. But again, it's something I want to get to at some point. It's still a lot easier than the single leg things. All right, so it's another version of glute strengthening that you'd want to include. All right, so now we're at the point of single leg strength, and this is where I'm going to be using the hip airplane. So very, very difficult exercise, even though it's only body weight. So all I have to do is really it's a single leg deadlift. So I've got to bend over and then try to rotate out to the side. Now this is where it gets really tricky, and a lot of foot stability. So the first time that we've seen foot stability become involved, so far everything's been bilateral stances or on the floor, so the necessary foot stability has not been brought into it. This is the first time we're looking at this, and it could be a real big part of the problem. So if you don't address that, you're not going to get very far. So I might have needed to use various foot drills to try and enhance that. All right, now I could do various regressions of this, or I might even have to regress it. So if I can't balance very long, I might have to cheat on it. So holding on to something and then just so taking the balance out of the equation, then learning how to get the action itself. So very similar to like the crab walk, how I'm rotating, but in the single leg stance, it's really a lot harder. All right, so now let's say I've got the hang of that. I could actually bring into play some like banded stuff where I'm actually forcing the glute into like its weakness. So this is a hell of a lot arguably harder than doing weighted single leg deadlifts. It takes a lot of control. This can't do many reps. Got to work really, really slow. All right, so it can be a really effective way before I start trying to crush things with load. All right, so let's have a look at the next one. Okay, so no surprise here. This is your standard single leg deadlift or Bulgarian deadlift. Very, very difficult to master and get right, this one. All right, so really, again, all these ones that are difficult, they all share the same problem. That you're really exposing the glutes into their weakest point, which is in that bent over position where everything's stretched apart and needs to generate a ton of strength to be able to control the alignment of the lower limb, but also be able to push the body forward so you can either stand up or lifting things or move forward as if you're running and walking. All right, so that's why this one has such a high relevance to changing everything, and it's usually the one I'm stuck on for a long time. The one disadvantage it has is it's always working slowly. So where the glutes being a fast twitch muscle fibre and predominantly designed for heavy lifting and explosive movements, this is not heavy lifting or explosive. It could be heavy lifting, but usually the balance limits the ability to lift as much as you can. But it can be a really good exercise. It is a good exercise, but it can come with a lot of problems if you rush to it too soon. All right, so let's look at variations of this where I start to bring in the faster speed to mimic more of how it's designed to work, as opposed to just its single leg stance and strength as such. Okay, so now we got like a step up version. So I'm really going to be positioning myself in the same position, but it's a lot more explosive. So I've got this really fast, there's my hip extension in that deadlift position. You can see where I'm not upright, I'm actually quite bent over, and there's my glutes really loaded in that exposed position again. And look how much arm swing I've got, because I'm trying to really, this arm swing really helps this bottom leg to come through with hip extension. So generating this huge wind up, so through my core and my glutes, to help me move really efficiently. All right. So this can be a real good way to actually expose that single leg stance, but with speed and not so much with load, to get it to actually function more like it's designed to. I could definitely add load to it as well, which compromises some of the speed, and I lose the arm swing. But again, it can be a really handy way. The foot on the floor does push off a bit, so you do get a bit of a cheat on it. I suppose that's why some people don't like it, because it doesn't isolate the glutes, but it definitely is really handy to try and get used to adding that explosive speed and making it work like a fast twitch fibre muscle, which you'll be able to see in a minute that I can do a little bit more easily in other movements. But this is quite simple, where it's just me focusing on the legs, and I can get that real good swinging feeling. You can see I'm now starting to swing the dumbbells again. All right, so let's look at the next version. Okay, so this next version is very similar to the last one. Now I've just got a band added around the leg, so I've got the resistance coming in. So it's very similar to what I just did with the step up. Now I'm actually stepping back instead of up. So this leg, the stance leg, the right leg right there, is loaded in this stance, but then it's actually loaded when it moves backwards as well. So I get a really good interaction with glute max and glute medius. So a lot of glute medius in the stance phase, and then a lot of glute max in this reverse hip extensions phase. All right, so I could start to really speed this up and use my arms to swing, which gets that big force generation that we was talking about with speed. So I'm doing this very slowly, but as I start speeding it up and adding the weights to it, it really makes a huge difference. All right, so let's look at the next one. Okay, so now I'm starting to work really quickly, and I've featured this exercise many times. I really love this exercise. Really works the posterior sling really well. So I'm really generating tons of force through that right leg, and then getting that step back, and even better, getting that transfer onto the left leg. So I'm actually using the glutes even in the stance phase on that left leg when I'm up high. With all the swinging of the dumbbell and the bent over position, I'm creating heaps of power. Just cannot do this exercise slow. You have to do it quick. That's also one reason why I really like it. It really ties together all of the things with the single leg stuff that we've looked at previously. All right, now this next one would sort of like the lateral movement, so it's really a lateral bound. All right, so that's where I'm using speed to go in that lateral direction, almost like an ice skater. All right, so I can really jump out to the right side. There's my bent over position, but instead of going forward or backward, I'm going sideways. All right, so there's again that different actions of the hips that it can do, and the glutes are the real key to all this. You know, so I can, again, speed is the force here, so I can really accentuate how fast I want to move this. I can also add load to it if I want, but sometimes I don't really need to. I just need to make it quick. If I'm adding load to it, I don't really need a massive load. I could have a band around my hip. Used to do that quite a lot in the days of the sports training stuff. Can be really useful, but most people would struggle with this if they come from a hip problem. They would already find this difficult on its own. So, and again, like I said, just jumping for distance or speed is going to be more important than adding load. It'd be like a plyometric drill. All right, but it can be another great way to really tie together everything that I've been using. So I'm getting all these different angles, all these different actions, sometimes abduction, sometimes extension, sometimes one leg extension, you know, sometimes it's forward, sometimes it's backward, all these different things. I want to really get your glutes and your core working the way it's supposed to. All right, and you can see how everything went from really slow, floor, two leg, slightly loaded, then it's two leg, then it's loaded one leg, then it's faster, working with the split stance and the backward and forward and lateral directions. And tying all of these things together is really what you need to do. You know, and ongoing, you might have to flick back and forth between the lot to try and finish the job. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed this video, and it's given you quite a few ideas of how you can progress everything.